Thank you for joining me today. My name is Cassandra Dinkelman. I am the Education Support Officer at Down Syndrome Queensland. Today's webinar is Positive Behaviour Supports. If you have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to send me an email, edsupport@downsyndromeqld.org.au, or phone us at the office 3356 6655. Thank you. Enjoy. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional custodians of the land that we're on today. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging. As with all children, regardless of ability, we all experience and display trying behaviours. Those closest to us are the ones who experience it most, your family, for example. They see the worst of you and hopefully the best. Children with Down syndrome may also display some very challenging and unwanted behaviour. During this webinar, we'll outline some of the potential behaviours that we can encounter. We'll look at some of the reasons for them and give strategies to help deal with and eradicate this behaviour. These strategies can be used across a range of students and settings. They're not only for students with Down syndrome, but they do take into account their learning and understanding capabilities. Your choice of behaviour strategies will often be guided by a whole school approach. But if those aren't working for your students or you're looking for other ideas, we'll share a few here. Here are some of the unwanted behaviours that you might see. Excessive self-talk. This can be talking to themselves, singing or interrupting. It's generally not meant in a negative way. It's just a behaviour that can be disruptive. Inappropriate role play. Students with Down syndrome learn from and mimic what is going on around them. So friend choices and social groups are very important for those students with Down syndrome, because if they are with children who make poor choices, they are likely to copy. Students with Down syndrome need to have explicit social stories and behaviour intervention to ensure that they are interacting appropriately with others, working on distinguishing between appropriate and inappropriate behaviour. Aggressive or disruptive behaviour. This can be as simple as saying no to everything given to them, or I don't want to, or it can be pushing, hitting, pinching, escaping or avoiding attention. The thing that's important to keep in mind with this type of behaviour is whether or not the student is becoming frustrated, especially if they have trouble communicating their wants and needs. It might be a tactic for attempting to get out of doing something when it's too hard. Maybe they didn't understand the instructions. So remember that behaviour is almost always secondary to another issue. Self-stimulatory behaviours, repetitive behaviours. This is sometimes referred to as stimming. These are classified as repetitive body movements or repetitive movements of objects in order to stimulate the senses in some way. It's unlikely that you will eradicate this behaviour, but lessening its distraction on the classroom environment is important. You're aiming to avoid disrupting the rest of the class. So perhaps they have a desire to open and close the tidy tray. Maybe give them something smaller that they can open and close, like a small box with a magnetic clasp. The behaviour generally will be a stimulating or calming activity, which could be addressing things such as anxiety, excitement, any number of reasons. Avoidance strategies. This is a common strategy adopted by many students, not just those with Down syndrome, where they might seem disengaged, they're not understanding expectations, there's no understanding of start or finish, maybe a dislike of the task, either because it's sensory, because they're tired, or it's tiring, it's too easy, too hard. Maybe they're preferring self-direction, or they're having issues with problem solving. All children have things that they don't like to do and things that they do like to do. When we present them with something undesirable, most children or students are extremely quick to find ways to avoid it. What we need to do is acknowledge that they don't like doing it and still get them to engage in the activity. They might run away or hide or simply refuse. Give them that verbal recognition. So, for example, I understand that this activity is challenging for you or that you don't like it, but today, if we were doing writing, for example, I want you to write 3 sentences for me. Then we can choose an activity from the choice board for 10 minutes. This gives them the acknowledgement that they understand, you understand their struggle, but you have set the expectation and subsequent reward. Oh, I have trouble saying that. Subsequent reward. You're not giving in. You're not letting them avoid the topic. Running away, this could be thought of as non-compliant behaviour, and in some cases it's true. It might be a response to sensory sensitivity, could be that it's too crowded, too noisy, too many instructions, or there's uncertainty. But by implementing some behaviour strategies in a buddy system, we can help students to either overcome these issues or find a suitable alternative. For example, when it comes time to lining up, many classes end up lining up underneath an undercovered area, which means that the area or the children involved or the students involved are noisy. So that becomes an issue for the student. So perhaps they line up or they stand waiting for the class at a different corner or in a slightly less noisy environment. Make sure that they can still be seen and that you know where they are and that the teacher on duty knows what they're doing there. Maybe they could be holding a friend's hand or doing a job with a friend, those sorts of things. Apart from being considered non-compliant, though, running away can also be dangerous, and we want to ensure that all students in our care are safe. It's imperative that if you have a child who's running away, refusing to sit or stay with the rest of the class, you look deeper at why. Is it too noisy? Are they overstimulated? Do they fully comprehend the expectations? Do I need to buddy them up? There are a number of reasons that they could be running away from the environment, and generally it's not because they're naughty. I'd suggest conducting a functional behaviour assessment on a child who continually runs away to discover the underlying issue. Encourage the students to help each other stay safe as well. So, for example, if any child runs into an out-of-bounds area or somewhere dangerous, make sure that they know to tell a teacher straight away. Use visual support such as lanyards or communication banners or simply photos of the zones. Having a green background with a photo of that child in the area that they're allowed in, or a red background and a photo without the child in the photo. So that they know they're not allowed in that area. Explicitly teach the child, repeatedly if you have to, about where they are allowed and not allowed to go. Attention seeking. These behaviours are considered anything that a student does in order to draw attention to themselves, a way of seeking social interaction in some cases. It can be constantly calling out, lying on the floor when everyone else is sitting, sighing loudly, wandering around the room, tapping, opening and closing the drawer, for example. The list is endless. And although these behaviours are considered low-level behaviours, they're still disruptive and they need to be addressed. However, let me stress to you that you need to know your students, because sometimes the child's noise or movements might be involuntary, in which case they're not doing it for attention, and drawing attention to it might increase the behaviour. In this case, the activity might be done as a way to self-soothe or to regulate in times of anxiety or stress. Stubbornness. Quite often, it's assumed that people with Down syndrome are stubborn. And I would like to say to you that they're not stubborn, They are more passionate, and this can often be seen in a positive light too. So when there's something positive they want to be doing, they really truly go for it. And the same can be said for things when they really don't want to do something. They really truly will avoid it. Sexuality. So a common concern raised to us with older students is sexuality, in terms of schools contact us about behaviours that are potentially sexualised, and in many cases it isn't. Sometimes it's sensory, sometimes it's developmentally appropriate. We just have to be thoughtful. We have to offer thoughtful consideration around health and sex education and discuss this with the family. Find out whether it's been an issue previously, how possible situations have been addressed, and how to best educate other students in terms of appropriate responses. In this case, we'll need to explicitly teach about what public and private behaviours are and revisit that if necessary. If you'd like support with dealing with that area in particular, we have a great selection of books, and our support team at Down Syndrome Queensland are able to help as well. Physical outbursts. So that goes back to communication, as we were discussing before. When a student has difficulty communicating their wants, needs, their interests, then often they will lash out with physical aggression. So let's look at some reasons why these behaviours may be present. Remember, no two children are the same, regardless of ability. So different behaviours can be displayed. This is a reminder that when you're working with a child, you need to remain consistent and clear, whether it be giving instructions, your expectations of behaviour, or even teaching. Ensure that you are clear and consistent. You set the behaviour expectations and keep them. All those engaging with the student must carry the same message, particularly in terms of expected behaviour. Behaviour is a way for an individual to gain something that they want, such as attention, a possession, or avoid something that they dislike, including work or a sensation. The key is to anticipate the contributors and the motivators of unwanted behaviour and resolve these as much as possible. Knowing the student enables you to be proactive, stepping in before the behaviour happens or escalates. That can be any number of things. Knowing that sports day is coming up, for example, you might send the child home with a social story or alert the family so that they can discuss the situation and prepare the student. Perhaps they have hearing protection, ensuring that they're made available for an overly noisy situation. You might know that a certain student finds writing challenging and often acts out when it's time to do the daily journal entry. So preempt those sorts of things and offer journal entry through pictures or through using talk to text on an iPad. The key is to anticipate the contributors and eliminate them as much as possible. What we sometimes see as a failure to behave properly is actually a failure to communicate properly. So the first thing we'll ask you when you ring to discuss behaviour concerns is whether or not the child has adequate and consistent communication, whether it be a pod book, communication board, lanyards, sign, speech. Because if they're limited in their ability to communicate, then that would be the first suggestion. Provide communication that allows the student to express themselves effectively. Also, explicitly teaching how to effectively communicate with their peers. And that would be things such as turn taking, joining in. Allow the student to succeed as much as possible. You might have observed things in the playground such as shoving or other physical behaviours, but when you're breaking down the incident, you can see that they haven't successfully or appropriately communicated what it is that they want. When you see a behaviour, ask yourself, Have I provided the student with communication strategies that work for them and are appropriate to the situation? It might be a good opportunity to show all students how to effectively and appropriately communicate. However, if the child is verbal and has the ability to communicate, but you're still encountering unwanted behaviours, some of which might be dangerous, might be harmful to the student or others, they might be disruptive, non-compliance, then we would begin to direct you towards behaviour strategies. We'll only look at some of these today, but just as an idea of what you could consider, here are the 3 that we're going to discuss today. Zones of regulation, positive behaviour supports or PBS, which is used in most schools, and functional behaviour assessments for those high-end behaviours. Although each of these can be used in isolation from the others, in cases of extreme behavioural issues, it can be beneficial to utilise all 3 for the greatest outcome and ensure that behaviour is replaced with a more appropriate or more desirable behaviour. Starting with zones of regulation. So zones of regulation refers to the process of assisting students to learn skills so that they can regulate their actions and behaviours, thus giving them increased control and problem-solving abilities. It's a good idea to model behaviours and express emotions in an appropriate way. It helps students to see the zones of regulation. Leah Kuipers created a whole program around this, and it's a great resource if you're interested. She states that it's a system geared towards helping students gain skills in consciously regulating their actions, which in turn leads to increased control and problem-solving skills. So using zones of regulation teaches students to recognise their emotions. It's giving them explicit strategies on what to do with their emotions, and it helps them to see that everyone has emotions, but it's what we do with them that counts. And you might have seen the zones of regulation on this poster or presented in this way with a poster. It gives students a visual or visual zones that are colour-coded and allows them to put themselves into a zone and give them a cue on what they could do when they're in that zone. So, for example, the blue zone is a low state of alertness. They might be feeling tired or sad or bored or sick. The green zone is known as good to go, feeling calm or good or proud, okay. The yellow zone is heightened state of alertness, so elevated emotions, starting to feel frustrated, silly, scared, overwhelmed. And the red zone is extremely heightened and intense emotions. And they can be feeling things such as aggression, terrified, angry, mad. Students learn about the zones, and underneath they come up with strategies for getting out of that zone. For example, feeling tired, have a bit of a stretch, awaken your brain. There are plenty of video examples on the internet, and some even use the characters from Inside Out to help explain the zones. Here are some examples that we found on Pinterest. So that's a great place to look if you're looking for ideas. But so these are quick and colourful visuals, and you can help students to register how they're feeling and what they're going to do to regulate themselves. Sometimes these are used as whole class activities, but for those who are working on getting out of the red zone, that's not necessarily a good idea. So for this reason, I would suggest that you could use this as a personal activity, something perhaps shared with the teacher or a peer, but not the whole class. This is one of my favourite ones. So you give the children or the students each of these, and the 4 tools that they use, they can choose which tools they're going to use, maybe discuss them, and then they put them into a nice little key ring like this one. I think this is a great idea. and put it in their tray. So you could teach this explicitly in the start and constantly use the language from the zones. You refer back to it whenever you need to, and even modelling that as the teacher. So modelling how you're feeling at that particular moment, just so that they can see there are a range and that we all feel a range of emotions. Before that can work, though, we need to know that students don't always understand or recognise the emotions that they're feeling. So we've made these free downloadables on our website, which bring emotional regulation back one step. So with using Leah Kuyper's zones of regulation, this would help in the stages before that, explicitly teaching students about each of the emotions that they might feel, for example, tired, and then looking at options for what to do when they feel that way. So what would be appropriate? Don't assume that students understand all the emotions. Be sure to talk through the emotion and brainstorm together what it looks like, what it feels like, what might be happening when you feel that way. By recognising their emotions, they'll be more able to regulate them. So these resources are fully customisable according to the needs of the students. You can choose the emotion and select calm down options together. It creates independence and emotional regulation, and it requires explicit teaching. You can't just expect the students to be able to do this on their own. And then you would end up with something like this. So, for example, I feel worried and I can choose to, and you've chosen appropriate activities there. You could use social stories or books with particular emotions to explicitly identify how each emotion feels, possible reasons for how you're feeling that way before looking at how to regulate them. Positive behaviour supports, or PBS. This is a behaviour management system used to understand what maintains an individual's challenging behaviour. So it takes the focus away from stopping or controlling the behaviour, the challenging behaviour, and centres instead on positive reinforcements. It's a proactive approach rather than reactive. It focuses on encouraging desirable behaviours through the use of positive reinforcements. I've worked in schools that have had many different systems. So, for example, one that I particularly enjoyed was a raffle ticket system, and you catch the children doing the right thing, or we called them gotchas. Gotcha. You were waiting in line for your turn. What a lovely thing to do. Thank you for waiting patiently. You've got a gotcha. And so they put it into the collection tub, and then maybe it's drawn out during assembly. You could have a class one, year level one, whole school one, whatever you think is going to work for your students. And you could be working on it, giving them praise or prize. If you're going to look at prizes, though, I would suggest something that's going to cost you not a lot at all, and possibly something that you can use over and over again. But what you're looking for is a currency for the students, something that works for them and grabs their attention, the hook, I like to say. And sometimes schools do things such as maybe have gems or those sorts of things where the children get to go to a rewards shop, and maybe they can use one gem to receive one reward, or they might find that there are certain rewards that are bigger and require 5 gems, so they have to save up for their reward in the shop. Things like that often work as well. For any of these ideas to work, though, as I said, you need a currency or a motivator, that hook, something that grabs the child's interest and motivates them to do the right thing. But finding that something that works for most students. Consider those that struggle to be motivated, because they very well might find this type of positive behaviour support doesn't work for them. But this is how we're able to teach students to self-manage their behaviour using this rewards or currency kind of support, behaviour support. Set out clear and achievable student-friendly expectations when you're doing this kind of thing. You might want to set this up around a theme or the school mascot or the school motto. Offer good choices in situations. Role play them if you have to. In some situations, you might consider using a timer or tags to help support positive behaviours. So, for example, in my role play area, when I used to teach prep, we found that students were constantly arguing with each other about being squashed in the area or not having enough resources in that area. So we reduced the number of children in the area to 4, and we gave them a timer and tags. So there were 4 tags hanging up. You were only allowed in the area if you had a tag on. The timer went on as soon as everybody had their tags on. They played for that time. When the timer went off, they hung their tags back up and the next 4 people had their go. That seemed to work. Having those sorts of things works for students. So PBS is a 3-tiered model of support. This bottom layer applies to 80 to 85% of the school population. That's where they're targeted. And they'll understand and meet the expectations accordingly. The middle tier applies to some of the community, with about 5 to 15% of students falling into this category who might still struggle to understand or comply with a positive behaviour system. And the top tier is the few, making up approximately 1 to 7% of the school population. But importantly in this, I want you to know that students with a disability are suspended twice more often as their non-disabled peers, which means that they're falling into the some and few tiers. And that's why we need to help them understand the expectations and put in place behaviour modifications that are going to help. So you might use things such as, so Eagle Grove Elementary School has be safe, be respectful, be responsible. Or they might have something like this, using the school motto mascot. Or the 4 Bs, for example, be respectful, be responsible, be safe, be prepared. Most schools tend to do this sort of thing. But what about the some? For those who struggle to abide by the rules and expectations that we set for them, we need the all approach isn't enough support for them to succeed. So they need a more scaffolded approach, a variety of strategies. And this includes some students with Down syndrome, but not all. It's important to look at the behaviour as a way to communicate to us. For example, a child who is frustrated or angry might have an inability to communicate. We need to assist them to communicate their wants, needs, and desires. There might be a refusal to work. So maybe it's too hard, maybe it's too labour intensive. Offering alternatives such as technology to support their learning or choices. Maybe the student is feeling overstimulated, offering things such as calming music, breaks or sensory breaks. Inappropriate behaviour. It might be that we incentivise correct behaviour through rewards charts and currency, for example. Maybe it's too noisy. We could offer noise cancelling headphones, maybe remove to a quieter space. Maybe they're feeling cranky or despondent. They could be sick, or they could have had a bad night's sleep, a poor night's sleep. Often students with Down syndrome, you'll find that one day they're having a particularly off day and the next day they'll be off sick. And it's not because they were being naughty, it's because they weren't feeling well within themselves, but they're not able to communicate to us necessarily. Perhaps they're lonely, so we need to provide social skills with their peers supporting as well. Maybe they're feeling too busy or sad. We just need to give them some time out, but not time out in a way because they're naughty, time out because they need that quiet space. Perhaps they're hungry. Maybe we could be suggesting that they have something to eat. Maybe it's the type of food that they're eating that needs to change, or it could be sensory. Maybe it could be an issue with their thyroid, or they could be confused and disengaged. So perhaps we need to reteach and simplify what we're expecting of the student. Break or timeout cards. So a great idea is to offer break or timeout cards. But before we use break cards, it's important to think about what you're trying to achieve and limit the amount of break cards that you offer. For example, if the child or if the student particularly struggles during a certain lesson, you might need to offer them more break cards just so that they can break the lesson down into smaller chunks. There might be some subjects or some activities where they enjoy it and they are completely engaged the whole time. They might not need as many breaks. Ideally, the cards become a tool for students to learn coping skills. So they register their emotions, they regulate their behaviour and give themselves space. And the use of cards wouldn't mean that they are escaping the activity. It just means that they get the opportunity to regulate themselves. And once they've regulated themselves, they come back to that space and they're ready to proceed with the activity. It's an opportunity for them to avoid undesirable behaviours and then come back once they're feeling more centred. It's important that these are timed too. They can't be free choice. Using a visual or a sand timer or a traffic light timer, I know in the past as a teacher, I have given a student a chance to have a break. You get distracted with working with one group and then suddenly before you know it, the student has had a much longer break than you anticipated. So make sure it's a noisy timer of some kind or something that's attached to you in some way. We have free downloadables for these break cards on our website. So the break cards would be beneficial when they're used correctly because they're individualised intervention. They help students regulate themselves. They're specific to students and situations. They can be used as a calming strategy and it offers an alternative way of communicating. So what should these breaks look like for students? We're working on helping them to recognise when their feelings are escalating. We're wanting them to have a rest from an activity or a sensation. It shouldn't be something too strenuous, but it should still be enjoyable. So some ideas might include things such as a sensory box, a fiddle activities, feather glitter bottles in sensory visual sensory visual items, reading or looking at a book quietly in a beanbag chair, doing a job. So you might send them to the office with a quick job with a partner, or you might have a system set up with a buddy class next door. When the student turns up, ask them 3 questions and then send them back to the classroom, just so that they've got that momentary break. Maybe they could be listening to music, but make sure that they are listening to music quietly. They're not singing along, they're not dancing along. These are just some of the suggestions, and there are many, many more. You can use things such as Play-Doh or colouring, maybe drawing, educational games on an iPad, puzzles. Use what they love, but limit the time that they're doing it. Certainly no non-educational games would be acceptable on iPads. Remember, it's not a reward, it's a break. So it's knowing the students' needs and discussing them with their family, making sure that they're happy with what you're suggesting will happen and that they understand the choices. remember, the family might have ideas that you might not have considered as well. It's always a good idea to try something, and if it doesn't work, then scrap it. So, for example, I once worked with a class. They were year 6, and they had learnt over time that their break from the class was the computer lab before I got to them. And so over time, the students, this break time had become more and more lax. So the students understood, which wasn't correct, that they were allowed to get up in the middle of class, go to the computer lab, and then play whatever they liked on the computer. So once I came in to be their teacher, we had to establish a desirable activity within the classroom that they wanted to stay to be part of. So we had to remove that computer lab experience. It took a little while, but we found lots of things that we were able to enjoy together, or at least quietly within the classroom. You might have used something like this in the past, rewards charts. I know I have. I've definitely had these for my class in the past, but have a look at it. There are far too many boxes, and it feels unachievable. And therefore it becomes not motivating for the students. So, for example, they get the first 3 and then they realise, gosh, there's an awful lot of squares there that I have to fill before I get my reward. Maybe you could break it down in some way. We have some rewards charts or rewards systems available on our website, but I'll just go through these. So let's look at how and why we use a rewards chart. We use a rewards chart because it's a visual way to support positive, wanted behaviours. They work off the student's token economy, and they're completely individualised to the student's requirements. So I have no doubt that we're all using some sort of reward chart in the classroom, some sort. So what we need with rewards charts is something that's visual behaviour support, that token economy. Look at the amount of times that I've managed to do something right or well. Select a target behaviour for that student or for that class, whoever it is that you're working on rewarding. And it would be something like using kind words or kind behaviours. Select the number of times that the behaviour must be demonstrated to receive the reward. So, for example, you might start with 3 times and then they receive a reward. And as they get better at doing that activity, it becomes more of an instinctual behaviour, then we would increase the amount of times that they have to do it before they're treated to their reward. It might be that you're rewarding per session, per day, per week. That's up to you and what works with the student as well. But the rewards would be individual motivators. So offer a choice board to use something such as, for example, you can choose one of these 3 things as your reward when you do this behaviour 3 times in the session or in the day. Allow the students to be actively involved in the chart too. Well done, you've received your reward. Give the star or the smiley face or whatever it is to them, and they can place it on the chart. That helps. So the first thing you need to do is select one target behaviour that you want to change and then demonstrate that as a positive. Pick the behaviour that needs to change the most. Something physical, the thing that you really don't want in your classroom or within the playground anymore. For example, keeping your hands to yourself. Maybe we would say that we're using kind hands or gentle hands. Maybe it's taking turns, so sharing resources, those sorts of things. Catch the students doing the positive thing as much as you possibly can, and verbalise why you like what you saw. I really like the way you were standing in line behind your friend there. You weren't touching them, you were just patiently waiting for your turn. Well done. Those sorts of things. you can have a star to put on your reward chart. And so they know we've only got 2 more times before we might receive a reward, those sorts of things, helping them to regulate themselves. Once the behaviour is solid and can be displayed without requiring that instant positive reinforcement, you're now ready to tackle the next behaviour. But you would then start again. So smaller numbers of times, more reminders of what we're looking for, starting off with praising them, well, always praising, and then increasing the amount of times that they need to do something before they're rewarded for it. So when you're deciding on a reward to give to students, it's important to base it off what the child likes, their motivator or currency. Each student's going to be different and will be motivated by different things. But in the past, I've found things like iPad time, prize box, sensory box, games, jigsaws, reading, Play-Doh. They all work well as rewards. And I like to, as I said to you earlier, use something that doesn't cost money and that I can use over and over again. Before setting the task, get the student to select their reward so that they know what they're working towards. So this is allowing, because we're allowing the student to be actively involved in that reward chart, we're allowing them or giving them responsibility and ownership of whether or not they're earning their reward. And it's important to remember when you're talking to them as well, I really like the way you did that. And you see that's given you 1 more reward point. Therefore, you only have 2 more reward points to go, or whatever, however you're going to do that. But encouraging them as you go along. And these are what our ones look like at Down Syndrome Queensland. These are available on our website, starting with the smaller number 1 at the top left-hand corner, and then moving on to the one at the bottom right-hand corner. They come in stars or smiley faces. And this is a great way to demonstrate and consolidate a child's understanding of the expectation as well. So as I said, it might be over a session, it might be over a day, it might be over a week. The idea is to start with small, with those constant reminders, and that helps to change that behaviour as well. So with using rewards like this, we're incentivising the behaviour and improving their work ethics, so giving those extrinsic motivations or motivators. It allows students to self-monitor their behaviour. They can see how many they've got and how many they need to get before they receive their reward. It establishes clear behaviour and expectation guidelines. It's visual, but the rewards don't need to cost anything. Okay, so we've covered the bottom tier for the majority of students. We've looked at the ideas for the second tier for the some students, but what about the top tier of the few? The ones that risk suspension or expulsion, the ones that haven't responded to the interventions that have been put in place. Their behaviour needs to be put under the microscope. And the way to do that is through a functional behaviour assessment or an FBA. This is looking at the behaviour and the reasons behind it. So often an FBA is done because the behaviour is high level or dangerous. If the behaviour is dangerous, then we recommend involving a psychologist to do the FBA. You might have a behaviour specialist or someone trained to do this at your school, but I'll give you just an insight into the FBAs that can be done within the classroom or by the teacher if the behaviour isn't dangerous. So a functional behavioural assessment is a systematic process for gathering information in order to determine the relationships between a person's problem behaviour and aspects of their environment. Through an FBA, it's possible to identify specific events that predict and maintain behaviour and design a support plan that effectively addresses those variables. FBA methods can and should vary across circumstances, but typically include recording reviews, interviews, direct observations. There might be a behaviour that's common for students, such as running away, but that doesn't mean that they'll have the same FBA, that the same FBA will work from one student to the next. It's individual to the child. If you're doing an FBA, then there's no doubt you are seeing behaviours which are disruptive or dangerous or rude. What we need to find out is what the function of that behaviour is. Why are they doing it? The children aren't, I'm going to say to you, children aren't innately naughty, but they do produce behaviour to help them survive and feel comfortable, as we all do. For example, if you have a headache, you know how to drink lots of water, eat well, perhaps take paracetamol. The function of that behaviour is to help you feel better and remedy the issue. In that example, my form, the way I approach it, was acceptable because I knew what I needed to do to help my situation. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, that's not an inbuilt ability. We don't innately know, or we don't instinctively know what it is that we have to do. It needs to be explicitly taught. So what I'm saying is that in order to deal with the undesired or unwanted behaviour, you'll need to look at the function it's providing and look past the form that it's being delivered in. So this is why an FBA is good, because it's used to determine what factors are contributing the behaviour. So I've had times when I'm watching my class, when they're with someone else, and you see a behaviour and you see the reason for it for the first time. It's a good idea to get help when you're looking for those factors, because someone else might see something that you haven't noticed, or not being in the centre of that activity. For example, when they're with somebody else, you might be able to see it, as I said, for the first time. It reminds us all that behaviours have a function. There is a reason. It's just that the form, the way they're doing, the way they're going about it, might be inappropriate. So functional behaviour assessments can be conducted to understand function in order to change the form. So we do it to find out what they're trying to achieve so that we can teach them how to achieve that appropriately. These can be conducted by the teacher, who is in regular contact with the individual, although some schools have access to the psychologist. As I said, bringing in a psychologist could be expensive, so you might try this with your teacher at first. Or if their behaviour is dangerous, as I said, you would bring in a psychologist then. And this is so that we can be proactive. Don't wait for the problem to become severe. Anticipate it and eradicate it. In many cases, behaviour escalates when the student is searching for a boundary or looking for specific feedback. So we need to find appropriate alternatives as quickly as possible. Conducting a functional behavioural assessment. So there are 5 steps to conducting an FBA. We define the behaviour and choose the most severe behaviour first. In everything we do, we want to choose the worst one first to eradicate that issue. Recorded through observations, interviews and school records. Number 2, collect the data, either through an ABC or a scatter plot, and I'll go through those in a minute. Number 3, hypothesize what's the problem. Draw conclusions through the data that you've collected, but stay focused on the target behaviour. Don't let it go off into lots of different directions all at once. Number 4, plan the intervention according to the data that you've collected and hypothesis summated. So from what we've seen, this is what we're doing and why. And then finally, evaluate if you've seen any behaviour changes and if there's any progress being made. Then if that's the case, you can go back to the, work on the next issue or concern. But if it hasn't, then you can go back to the top and start again. So an ABC of collecting data is the antecedent, behaviour and consequence. During step 2, you're collecting data for the FBA, and there are 2 ways to do that. Either the ABC model, which is this one, or a scatter plot model. And I'll go through this one and explain it to you. A is the antecedent, what is happening right before the behaviour occurs. Who or what is present. This could also be considered as the trigger. Then B is the behaviour. What are they doing? What are we seeing? C is the consequence. What happens right after the behaviour? And then look at the patterns. Does the behaviour only occur in a specific place or when a particular person is present? So, for example, Tim was asked to go back to his desk and complete a maths worksheet with his class. Instead, he went to his desk and yelled, "I can't do this," and stabbed a classmate in the arm with his pencil. What was the ABC of this? Can we come to a conclusion from this incident? So in this example, there are a number of things. He's not enjoying maths. He's not understanding the instructions. He wants to sit somewhere else. He was bumped on the way to his table. We don't know. Stabbing someone with a pencil, and as a consequence, he's then sent to the office. So he's missing out on the activity, or he's missing out on sitting next to that person, or he's avoiding the activity at hand. So the consequence was a positive for him, which means that we've reinforced that behaviour because it worked. So we then need to go back and look at that antecedent so that we can preempt it and change the outcome, because without doing that, we're going to see a cycle that isn't helpful for anyone. So the outcome for the child is likely to be suspension, exclusion, or other children avoiding them. A reputation that follows them as well. But from this one observation, we can't be sure of the antecedent. So we need to do this lots of times. We're looking for a pattern. You can collect data, a number of ways. So look through Pinterest and just Google ABC data collection. Even a quick scan through the images that crop up will give you an idea of the ways that you can collect it. The 3 on your screen now were from Pinterest. My top tips to you would be look for ones that require less writing, something you can highlight or tick, rather than collecting anecdotal records for the behaviour and then analysing those. You might list the parts of the day or the subjects down the side, the time, common behaviours of this child, possible antecedents, consequences, and then as you see them, you can highlight them. Over a number of observations, you can generally see a pattern emerging. It could be always during a particular topic or a day or a transition or a specialist lesson. And then looking further into that, you could be able to see specifically what's causing the undesirable behaviour. So it might be in music lesson, for example. It might be too loud. It might be the classroom. It might be the teacher. It might be a student who is in that music lesson. And then work from there. I found it works best if you can recruit someone else to support you in terms of these, because then you can either be observing them or have someone else observing while you're taking the class. You can make your own forms, or you can just find one that's as closely suitable as possible. So along with the data collection, it's important to attempt to distinguish why the behaviour might be occurring. So the form, why they're doing it, is undesirable in some way. So we need to look at the function, what they're doing, of that behaviour, or the reason they're doing that behaviour. What's the student getting from it? So we could be using SEAT, S-E-A-T. The acronym SEAT, to assist to distinguish what the potential function of the behaviour might be. So, for example, is it sensory? It could be a need for movement or actions. Is there another more appropriate way to help them get the sensory input that they're seeking? It could be escape, maybe from an undesirable situation or an undesirable task. Can we change the environment or give them a choice over the task? It could be for attention. Maybe they're looking for peer or adult interactions. Can they get that attention another way by using appropriate means? It could be tangible. Are they gaining access to a specific item or activity? Can they access that desired item or activity through reward rather than inappropriate behaviour? Like my class with the computer, for example. After gathering the data and conducting an analysis on it, you'll develop a hypothesis of why the behaviour might be occurring. So through that, you'll implement a behaviour intervention plan, or a BIP. These are used at lots of schools, and this is a teacher's perspective. This is a blurry one because I just want you to see the ideas. I don't want you to have to read through the whole thing, but you get the idea. It looks like this. It's a tick and flick kind of affair. So talk through it, make it easy to use, show a united front, make sure that everyone involved in that student's life has access to this, that they are aware of it and they are following it. So from the principal, the classroom teacher, specialist teachers, anyone on playground duty, anyone who interacts with that student knows what's going on with it. Talk it through, as I said, because that will help the student to know that this is how things need to be. They're getting the same message from every angle, that united front. It needs to be something easily understood and clearly written. It becomes part of the student's IEP. It's tailored to the student using proactive strategies. It puts the necessary supports in place. Who or how is this going to happen? And it allows you to implement and evaluate for effectiveness at the end. So components of a BIP are that there is information, the schedule, the case manager information, all those bits and pieces, what replacement behaviours we're looking for, the data of the student behaviour, so the collection, what did we find from it, students' supports, the duration of the plan. A BIP should never be permanent. It has an end date, so that should be on there. And how will we know if it's been successful? What will we do if it hasn't been successful? Some examples for a BIP include maybe arranging someone to meet a student on the bus to escort him through the buildings in the classroom so that they can enter the classroom more calmly rather than racing through when they get there. Maybe create and consistently use a quiet working place. Maybe a planned seating with their back to the to most of the activity in the classroom when they're working on something. Seating near the adult at circle time, modifying activities and expectations such as time on task, the number of activities, the criteria for completion to reflect the needs and capabilities of the student, providing for success and challenge equally. Maybe use a picture sequence chart or card, large for the class and small for the student, that outlines their daily schedule to help them anticipate large transitions. Announcing upcoming transitions and counting down to them is also helpful, having a timer for those sorts of things. In lines, give the student a task or a job, maybe carry something, as well as a place in proximity to the escorting adult helps. Here are some student-friendly examples to demonstrate what it might look like to the student. A BIP might include ways to change the environment, to keep behaviour from starting in the first place, provide positive reinforcements to promote good behaviours, employ planned ignoring to avoid reinforcing bad behaviour, and promote supports needed so that the student will not be driven to act out due to frustration or fatigue. You could use these as a student-friendly BIP where the student can see how their behaviour was perceived or recorded throughout the day and enable the student to see and maybe even reflect on their behaviour. For high school students, you'd want to create or use a document that has a more mature appearance, but still easily understood by the students. The Autism Hub and Resource Centre offers a free online functional behaviour assessment tool and will help you discover the reasons, the function of the behaviour. So it's important during this process to only focus on one behaviour and that it be the most prevalent or disruptive behaviour so that we can eradicate that more quickly. I liked working through this because they give you options for each box. So it's easy to fill in and then you can use what you gain from it in the end. Understandably, because it's a generic form, it might not cater to all that you need, but I found it to be a useful tool and covered most areas that I wanted to consider. And it's free. Free. It saves you from having to start from scratch. And you've got that option too of going back and reassessing some answers if it doesn't look how you want it to, as many times as you like, because it's free. Behaviour management is bigger than a moment of conformity. It's about teaching emotional regulation and coping strategies to last a lifetime. I know it can be hard as an educator dealing with behavioural outbursts, non-compliance and dangerous behaviours, but always remember that. It's about teaching emotional regulation. In society, consider what happens when we lack the ability to regulate our own emotions. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email at support@downsyndromeqld.org.au. Our next webinar is Reading Our Way. Information session on Thursday the 2nd of December. Here are some of our references. And there are my contact details if you would like them. Once again, thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you at the next webinar.